Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, the AJC Decatur Book Festival, DeKalb County Public Library, and DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to another in the series of Joshilyn Jackson Summer Reads. We are so very pleased to present this program to you once more virtually throughout the summer. It highlights so many wonderful authors selected by Joshilyn Jackson and her co-host this year, Nicki Salcedo. Just a few things before we begin this evening. I would like to remind you that after our formal presentation, if you would like to ask a question of any of the panelists, feel free to type those questions in the Q&A section that you will find located at the top or the bottom of your screen. Also, we've enabled live transcriptions this evening, so if you are needed that service, feel free to turn it on by locating the CC button at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your device. We're so very pleased to join with the AJC Decatur Book Festival again this year to present this series. As you know, last year during the pandemic, the series was put together from programs that were to be presented at the Decatur Book Festival. And we're so very happy that Joy Pope this year asked us to join with her to do this series throughout the summer, because we truly believe the Decatur Book Festival is one of those wonderful experiences that people have in the city of Decatur. And it draws people not only from all over Georgia and the South, but the United States and the world. In fact, this evening, one of our guests is in England and is staying up very, very late to talk with us tonight. So I would also encourage you to, if you have time and the inclination, to donate to the Decatur Book Festival. We will be doing something in the fall, but we hope in 2022 that the festival will be back to its full, wonderful weekend status, where we can invite you and authors from all over to just join us and join in the spirit and the joy of reading books and experiencing literature with fellow readers. You'll also find in the chat section links if you would like to order any of the books this evening. Little Shop of Stories is our local independent bookstore who's selected for this event tonight. And they are so happy to either mail books to you, have them available for local pickup, or they are doing limited browsing in store. So many of our independent bookstores across the country did so much during the past 15 months to make sure that we had the books that we needed, the books that we enjoyed, and to lift our spirits at times when the pandemic seemed to be truly pressing down on us. So I would encourage you to order from Little Shop of Stories or any of your local independent bookstores across the country this evening. I would also encourage you to support the Black-owned independent bookstores, because if we truly want a just society, we need to support them and help create a more diverse literary community. Right now, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our guests for you this evening. First is Claire Andrews, who is celebrating her book birthday tonight, so be sure to give her a round of virtual applause when you meet her later on. Claire was raised in both Alaska and Scotland, but currently lives in Vermont. When she's not writing, she usually can be found outside swimming, skiing, or hiking across her state's famous Green Mountains. Daughter of Sparta is her debut novel. It is the thrilling reimagining of ancient Greek mythology. A headstrong girl does whatever it takes to rise up and become the most powerful fighter the world has ever seen. Next is Genieve Gornichec. Genevieve earned her degree in history from Ohio State University, but the Ohio State University. I will go ahead and correct myself for everyone out there. But she has got close to majoring in Vikings as she possibly could, and her studying of Norse mythology and Icelandic sagas became her writing inspiration. She lives in Cleveland, Ohio, and The Witch's Heart is also her debut novel. The Witch's Heart, of course, is the story when a witch is banished, falls in love with the legendary trickster Loki. She risks the wrath of the gods in this moving, subversive national best-selling debut novel that reimagines Norse mythology. And finally, we have Jennifer Saint. Due to a lifelong fascination with ancient Greek mythology, Jennifer Saint read classical studies at King's College London. She spent the next 13 years as an English teacher, sharing her love of literature and creative writing with her students. Ariadne is her first novel, and she is working on another retelling of an ancient myth for her second, revolving around Clytemnestra and her daughter Electra. Of course, this book is for fans of Madeline Miller's Circe, but it tells the story of Ariadne, Princess of Greece, who grows up to meet the dawn of the beautiful dancing floor and listening to her nursemaid's stories of the gods and heroes. But beneath her golden palace echo the ever-present hoofbeats of her brother, the Minotaur, a monster who demands blood sacrifice. Coordinating the conversation between these three amazing authors tonight is local author and journalist Nicki Salcedo, who's been the co-captain with Joshilyn Jackson for this series this year and has been doing a absolutely bang up job. So would you please join me all to welcome Claire, Jennifer, Genevieve, and Nicki.
Thank you, Joe. It has been a wonderful year of reading books. I am so excited to be with these three wonderful debut authors today. And a special thank you to Joshilyn Jackson for inviting me to participate in this series. Jocelyn's a great friend and a lover of books. And I think she and I had a fun time sort of fighting over the books in the series and advocating for them and being excited to talk about them with our friends and our community and now the whole world. So I'd love to start with just an easy question about the premise of your books. And I'll just say these are characters we may think we are familiar with from mythology, maybe one-line characters, characters with maybe thin storylines that we now are going to get a full story around. So I'd love to get from each of your perspective what your story is about. And Jennifer, why don't I start with you?
Hi, yeah, so Ariadne tells a story that I think we are all familiar with, probably from childhood, the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur, but from the perspective of the woman who makes it happen and the woman who saves the hero. So it's really about exploring the stories of the women behind these legends and what really compels them, what motivates them, and what happens to them afterwards while the men are basking in their glory. What do they go on to do? So it's about giving them their voice and an opportunity to take center stage rather than being relegated to the footnotes of their stories.
Excellent. And we do think we know the story of Theseus until we read your story and we get something much different. Genevieve, what about your story?
The Witch's Heart is a reimagining of Norse mythology with a minor side character taking center stage. The giantess Angrboda, who is known as the mother of Hel, Fenrir, and Jormungand, the Midgard serpent, by Loki, who is getting his own show this week, at least the Marvel version. But like many of the female figures in the Norse myths, Angrboda is only mentioned by name. We literally don't know anything else about her. The Norse myths have a habit of just dropping these like lists of female names and then we don't get any stories about them. So I basically had all this opportunity to expand her story however I wanted, and The Witch's Heart is the result of that.
Excellent. And yes, we do have a little bit of a fascination with Loki, but we're going to get closer to maybe the original real Loki through your story. So thank you, Genevieve. And Claire, how about you? We have an adventure story. Tell us what happens in your book.
It's a reimagining of the Daphne and Apollo myth. So if you're familiar with Greek mythology, you don't actually know much about Daphne other than that she was chased relentlessly by Apollo until she literally turned herself into a tree in the original Greek myth. So I wanted to give Daphne her own story and her own voice and basically play the role that the heroes have gotten, the men have gotten to do for centuries. So Daphne in this one teams up with Apollo to basically save Greece.
And what I love about these three stories is, I mentioned, we think we know the stories. The stories here have sort of tragic endings, tragic elements. And I don't feel like it's a spoiler alert to spoil a story from 3,000 years ago, but some of these stories have really tragic consequences. And we have a look at these women, their loves, and their children and their adventures in a different way. In my mind, I love mythology quite a bit. When my daughter was reading mythology in school, she became very enraptured with it. And I have a lot of mythology books from college. So I was like, if you're interested, we're going to start reading through. And one day she just turned to me and she said, Mom, Zeus is a jerk. And I was like, that really summed up mythology in like a very succinct way from, you know, a 15-year-old girl who was like, Zeus is a jerk. But there's probably a story that initially brought you to mythology. And I'd love to know from each of you, what created your interest in these types of stories and maybe also these hidden characters? Was there an original story? And Claire, I'll start with you if you have a story that brought you to mythology.
I had a collection of Greek mythology stories growing up, and it was just like all of them. I absolutely loved every single one. I really liked Pandora's box, and I think that's kind of like the box that opened up my like love of Greek mythology in a way. But I'd say like I really, really got invested in it when I first read the Odyssey, and then I was also incredibly frustrated with it at the same time. And when I get really frustrated with stories, I tend to read them and watch them over and over again. And that's how I just got too into Greek mythology.
So Pandora's box opened up your creative
Yes.
mind. That's good. How about you, Genevieve?
So I also had a collection of Greek mythology stories when I was a kid that I really liked. So Greek mythology was really my first love because it was the first thing that I learned. And I read the Norse myths when I was younger too, and I was like, oh, these are fine. And then when I was in college, I took a class on the Old Norse language, and the first story that we translated was the one where Loki shapeshifts into a mare and gives birth to an 8-legged horse. And I was just like, wow, I forgot how weird these were. And it was just all, the rest is history. I got super, super into Norse mythology after that, just because it was so interesting. It was much more interesting to me as an adult.
Yes. Lots of room for giving birth to strange creatures, which brings us back to Jennifer, because there is a strange creature that somebody's mother gives birth to. I mean, your story, but how did you get interested?
Yeah, so I mean, the same. I was reading Greek mythology when I was a child. My parents used to take me on holiday to Greece, and the book that really got me into it was Roger Lancelyn Green's Tale of Troy, which is like a retelling from the 1950s of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and loads of other stories around it. And I went back to that book recently and reread it to see if it was as good as I remembered. And actually, I think there's a lot in there that had an influence on me, because in that book, Helen gets a chance to tell her side of the story, and it's a really sympathetic portrayal of her. And I think this idea of going to the women and having them speak and exonerating them of the crimes they've been accused of committing, I think was obviously ingrained in me from a young age. And Theseus plays a part. Theseus as this kind of fallen hero, some of the things that he got up to after the stories he's most famous for. So I think all of these things were obviously just captivated me from a young age and stayed with me, and I think it played a really formative role in my writing.
Well, thank you for writing your story, all of these stories. I should have paused at the beginning to thank you all for putting your words out into the world, because it is a really big gift for us as readers to climb into the lives of these characters and have history not feel like statistics, but kind of feel living and breathing and loving and funny. It's not all drama and tragedy. There's really sweet and beautiful moments. But mythology was given to us as a way to reconcile things in the world we could not understand. You know, where did fire come from? Where did life and love and jealousy, revenge? And I'm wondering if there are big topics or themes in your book that you are still trying to reconcile, themes in your story. And so I might start with you, Genevieve, of what through your story do you want us to take away?
So Norse mythology in itself, it's all leading up to Ragnarok, the end, or the beginning, like the end of everything, but the beginning of something new. And I think that there's a lot to say there about that kind of like cyclical, like nature of our own lives, like not just like birth to death, but like different phases of our lives that we go through. And Angrboda in the book has a bunch of these phases that she goes through in her very long life. So a lot of the times we feel that like maybe, we're grieving something that's ending, but celebrating something new that's beginning.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. What about you, Jennifer?
I I think in Ariadne, it's the kind of the big theme that the characters that Ariadne and her sister Phaedra, who are the two narrators, are probably grappling with is really how to live in a better way in this patriarchal society than the men. So they've got this tyrannical father, Minos, and Theseus, who is this faithless, glory-seeking hero, Dionysus, a god who is, kind of feckless and irresponsible. And I think it's the women who are grappling with is how can we succeed in this kind of a world, this world that's been created by men, that's ruled by men for the benefit of men? How can we not just survive in it, but actually do better and raise sons in a world that seems to value men for their ruthlessness and their cruelty rather than other attributes that they could have instead?
Mm-hmm. And isn't that so timely? I mean, I'm reading these stories, right? You're telling me I'm going back to ancient worlds, and the themes are exactly the same today. So
Yeah.
just take a page out of the news. So I like what you said there. How can we, not just survive, but thrive, be successful? How can we rebuild? Like, what happens if our whole world comes down? That kind of happened to us last year, Genevieve. The whole world kind of came down, and we're trying to build up a new world. Claire, what about from your perspective?
It's pretty similar. I mean, Daphne does actually come into contact with Ariadne at one point in the book, and it's about, like Daphne, for her journey, and the theme is really about acceptance in a lot of ways, because she has strived her entire life to be accepted by the Spartan people, but then towards the end she realized that it doesn't, like, she is more than that, and that's about, she needs to accept that for herself. Like, it's a different kind of strength that she needs to find. And I think a lot of women will hopefully understand, like, that we don't need to be accepted by society in order to accept ourselves and to be happy with ourselves and to find our own strength. And that was what I was trying to go with for my book.
Really great messages in terms of acceptance and strength. And, speaking as a person who, sometimes I don't feel accepted, sometimes I don't feel strong, and seeing how people can rise up. You all have characters who have a partner in crime of some sort. So maybe it's Apollo, maybe it's a mother and a child, maybe it's two sisters. Do you think it made it easier to illuminate your characters, to have them paired up, or sometimes there is a trio depending on the story? Did those other characters help you shine the light? And maybe Claire, just back to you on Apollo ... What should we think about, those type of friendship relationships?
Apollo has his own, like, thousands of years of history, and it's definitely tough to grapple with, but he brings out both the good and the bad in Daphne, and she does the same for him. And I think it's both of them really need to find, their weaknesses and their strengths and what they're good at, and they realize that they don't need the other person to do that. They need to find it within themselves. And because Apollo is such a contentious character, at times it created, like, an interesting dynamic between the two of them, but really, like, brought out Daphne's light in a lot of way, and it kind of helped her thrive in a lot of ways, because he pointed out to her, he's like, yeah, like, sure, you want to be a Spartan, but you could always be more than that. Like, why are you setting the bar at Spartan? So I kind of like that.
Maybe I should get that on a t-shirt. Like, why would I settle for being a Spartan? I could be more. That's a great idea. Genevieve, in your story, there are a couple of different relationships. So a friendship with another woman, Loki, who's a trickster husband, all the things Loki can be, and then also children. So there's different types of romantic relationships, but also motherhood. And then how does that impact your heroine?
So even though Angrboda kind of like starts off on her own, Loki becomes quickly like part of her life, even though she doesn't necessarily want him to be. And so between him and her children, she feels like she's kind of like rebuilt everything that she loses at the very, very beginning of the story. And then when that's all taken away, she has to learn how to be okay on her own. And then her relationship, am I supposed to spoil it? I don't know.
You decide. Give us a little,
Okay.
take us down the path a little way.
Okay, so this whole time she's had this very steadfast friend in the huntress Skadi, and by the end of the story, that has gone on to be more than just a friendship. And I think at that point in the story, Scotty is more like a compliment to her rather than like being her other half. And I think that those kinds of relationships, like with your partners, are really important.
Definitely. I love that. And, you know, we are reading these books, a lot of action, a lot of adventure, intrigue. Well, I should say I am reading for the characters. So I love that dynamic of the interplay of two characters. And Jennifer, in your story, we have sisters. And that's kind of a beautiful way, and almost a sister who rises up to be on another main character, really.
Yeah, and Phaedra's role really grew as I was writing. I didn't realise she was going to play such a significant part in it. But actually, it was one of the things that drew me to the story, because I knew Ariadne's story and I knew Phaedra's story, but they're always told, as far as I could see, in relation to the men in their lives. So Ariadne is always told in terms of her relationship with Theseus, and Phaedra in terms of her relationship with Hippolytus. But it just fascinated me that these two women were sisters and they'd grown up together in such a twisted family dynamic, you know, such a kind of shared childhood trauma when you think about the existence of the Minotaur and how he was brought to their family as this, like, as a punishment to their father that in fact made their mother suffer so much. And I really wanted to explore how that would shape them both. And I really wanted to consider what they would mean to each other and that bond that they would share and how important they'd be to one another. And also the fact that Phaedra, and again, like, I'll try not to spoil it too much, but she really goes on to live the life that Ariadne was supposed to live, that Ariadne was expecting to live. And I thought that was such an interesting topic to delve into. And I was just so much more interested to see how these women really related to one another rather than to Theseus and Hippolytus. I wanted to see what they were like as sisters.
Well, it was wonderful. So yes, that's exactly the kind of relationship we were curious about. I do want to remind our attendees that I can ask questions all night, but we do have a Q&A function. So if you look either at the top or the bottom of your screen, there may be 3 dots where you might see QA. Please use that function so you could submit your questions, because our authors would actually love to hear from you. So please, please, please use the Q&A function. And remember that tonight our event is partly brought to you in partnership with Little Shop of Stories, which is a great bookstore in our community. We love working with the different bookstores. So just a little reminder about Little Shop of Stories, and please use that QA function. Jennifer, you mentioned the sisters and how maybe one came to life a little bit more than you had anticipated, which I think is fun. Sometimes the characters are going to take control when you're writing. And I'd love to know a little bit about your process for creating, because does that mean you started with plot? Were you starting with character? How did you see this originally, and then where you ended up with the book that we have today?
So I think the thing with a myth retelling is that you do kind of have the main beats of the plot. They already exist. So the sort of the major events, I knew what was going to happen. So from that point of view, the plotting, I kind of could build around it. But because it's female characters and they are more secondary in the mythology, then that does leave you with these kind of big gaps to fill in. And that was really fun to kind of think about, well, what were they doing in the meantime? What were they doing in the parts of the story that we're not told? So that was really rewarding to kind of build that up, and especially to go back into their childhood, into Ariadne and Phaedra's childhood. And it was when I was writing that section of it that I realised how important Phaedra was to Ariadne, and therefore how important she was going to be to my story as well. So Yeah, so I think in terms of developing the plot, that is a great thing about mythology. You've got something to hang your story on, and then you can really focus on building the characters. And I think the challenge is to humanize them when they're in these big, brash adventures and they're in these kind of fantastical situations. It's really trying to make them come to life and be these sort of living, breathing, believable people in these impossible situations. And that's very challenging. But I love that of kind of trying to make them magical part of a story that you can really lose yourself in and feel like you could know these women even though they're in extreme circumstances. And I think what you said before about how strangely relevant so many of their experiences are to us today, like 3,000 years later, that really really surprised me as I was going through and researching more and more mythology and seeing, oh, hold on, this misogyny feels very familiar. This is very recognizable. This victim blaming doesn't seem to have gone away in the centuries that lie between us. So that was something that that really grew as well.
That's excellent. How about you, Genevieve? Was it a lot of character, or were you thinking about the plot, or were you really relying on a lot of the plot elements in yours?
Right, like I was. Like Jennifer said, the bones were already there because we have this whole mythology. In Norse mythology, we have like you could put the myths in order kind of from a beginning to an end. So there's my plot. And so basically I just had to build out the characters. Again, these women who get these very scant mentions in the myths. Angrboda herself is only mentioned by name twice, and both times in relationship to Loki and her children. We literally don't know anything else about her, but I ended up combining her with a couple other women from the mythology who are also super mysterious, but have kind of like her same associations. And from there, I was able to build her as a character and fill out her story from beginning to end. But the problem was that by combining her with these other characters, I had given her like phenomenal cosmic power, so to speak. So my challenge then was like, okay, how do I write a story about this super powerful, supercharged woman that I just, kind of put together and have her not be able to change Ragnarok at the end? So those were some interesting hoops. So the mythology being there already laid out for us is both a blessing and a curse, at least in the case of my book.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. And tons of action. And Claire, for you've got almost a traditional hero's journey of get these items, but there's still a lot of character. So how did that work when you were writing?
Like what they talk about for acting is they do method acting where the actors kind of get in character. And that's what I tried to do for Daphne, because I really, really wanted to create like an authentic Daphne. I wanted like a completely new character because we really didn't know anything about her going into it. Like, we don't know much other than her father and the fact that she turned into a tree. So I really just got in her head and I kind of let her punch her way through this challenge, literally and figuratively, so to speak. And it really helped. And then when I was integrating all the other myths in there, I tried to kind of flip them on their head. So like I had them kind of, as Jennifer was saying, like the posts, to follow along, but they were more like tent poles, so to speak. And I just kind of like used those and created my own story and kind of gave women and characters that you don't actually hear much about voices. And that was my goal. And when I got into the character, it made getting the emotions out a bit difficult, though.
There's a lot of emotions in these books, not the least of which rage. Like there's every emotion that happens. And actually, Claire, your comment there is a perfect segue into one of the questions from the Q&A, which was actually from Joshilyn Jackson, our host. A common thread I'm hearing here is creating space for female voices. What kind of research did you do to speak as a woman of these various time periods and cultures? And how much license did you give the fact that you're dealing with myth and not history? So that's kind of an interesting question. So you're bringing these voices to life, and then there's a little bit of research, but you're not researching history per se. So Genevieve, why don't I start with you? That's kind of an interesting question.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love that question. So I actually do Viking Age living history. And I've read a lot about Viking Age women. So I got to like pepper in some kind of like material culture things into the Witch's Heart. I get really excited about this, I'm sorry. But so a lot of the time I would be like sitting there writing and I'd be like, wait, like what would be her lighting source here? Like, or like, how would she carry all her potions around? Like, so just like random things like that that I like hadn't thought about in the first draft of the book, which I wrote like 10 years ago. And then once I started doing living history, I started like thinking about those things when I would revisit it to do revisions. So I didn't give myself a whole lot of leeway because I was like, I want this to be as accurate as possible, even though it's a myth and like nobody cares.
We do care.
I can technically do anything I want and just say, oh, it's mythology. But I really did try to give a little bit of history in there.
So, you know, readers know when an author is excited about what they're writing. We can tell reading when you're like, this is awesome, and it's the right pouch for the potions. So that goes a long way. Jennifer, how about you for the research part of mythology?
Yeah, the same, because you don't want to jar your readers out of it. And I think with Greek mythology that you're going to have classicists reading, and they are going to notice if you are throwing in something that couldn't have existed in the Bronze Age. I mean, I'm not saying that I didn't make any mistakes, I'm sure, but you probably find some. But I did take a lot of care to research as much as I could. But I mean, it's such a what survives from the Bronze Age is so fragmentary and so scattered, and it could lead me down all kinds of rabbit holes, because you would try and find out specifically, well, in this scene she's going to sit down, what would she sit on, like what would it be made of, how can I find this out? And you don't want somebody to be jolted out of the world, because even though it's magic and you've got a minotaur in the story, that's okay, but you don't want to put in some kind of material that hadn't been invented yet for another 1,000 years, that is going to make somebody suddenly think this isn't right, this isn't, I'm not in this world anymore.
Jump in, Genevieve.
You're right, like people do care. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that people don't care, because some people really do. And I had the same experience. I was like, I spent like hours researching door hinges for like Angraboda's cave door, and I was like, somebody from one of my living history groups, or somebody who has a degree in Viking medieval Norse studies, is going to tell me that these don't have the right door hinges. So exactly the same thing Jennifer was saying. Yeah. Like, even though people may not notice, but people may notice, and it just makes the world that much richer when you try to put in those details. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. How about you, Claire?
I had about a stack of textbooks almost as tall as me for my research, because the story actually began in my undergrad, and my undergrad focus was in social sciences and archaeology. And I actually drove one of my professors absolutely batty, because she'd be like, okay, what's your topic for your paper? Oh wait, I bet it's ancient Greece. Every time. And when I first wrote this draft, it was actually probably a bit overly detailed. No, it totally was overly detailed. I remember I had to cut out like thousands upon thousands of miscellaneous paragraphs talking about like the social strata of like ancient Crete. And readers are like, actually, so they care about that, but they don't care that much. Like, yeah. It's really awesome that you have a Greek glossary, but you really don't need to talk about that they were stuck in their house all the time. And it's funny, you have to like come up with like a balance in these stories, and like for stories that delve with history and such much loved characters and stories, you really have to like do your research, but also find like that balance. And that, I think that's almost like the trickiest part, is finding the balance between research and something that's actually interesting to read and isn't a journal article printed into a book format.
I ended up cutting 3 of the 4 paragraphs about the door hinges, by the way. So I'm right there with you, Claire.
the paragraphs that you deleted, post them on your website so we could read about the door hinges, because you know there's going
I
to be.
want to hear about them.
Okay.
And there was actually a question from the audience about actually the editing. So was there a part of your books that you had to cut due to editing that you loved writing and you hated to cut? So we just heard a little bit from two of you. Jennifer, how about you? What had to be cut that maybe you wish you could have kept?
Yeah, I had to cut a lot of Theseus because as somebody who loves the mythology, I was really excited to put in all of his stories, and you know there are so many terrible but fascinating things that he did. But really, in the editing, we cut a lot of it out because it's not his story. That's the whole point of writing Ariadne, is that it's not about Theseus. And I didn't want to put too much of you know his life into there because I wanted to give the space to Ariadne, but I did enjoy writing it. Because you know it was interesting to write the kind of traditional classical narrative of the hero's journey as well, and I think I probably did need to write it in the first draft in order to kind of identify, no, I want to write something different. I want to tell this from Ariadne's perspective, and I want different things to be important in her story. But I think I probably had to go through the process of writing his story first of all. So he did originally have about 15 pages where he told Ariadne everything he'd done on the road to Trozen, from Trozen, but all of that went in the bin.
I love that because, well, part of the writing process is the revising process, which some love or some less love, but it does inform the story, which I think is good. And you just mentioned something, Jennifer, that actually appeared in all three of your stories, which I loved, which is the story within a story. So somebody in the story tells us a story. And I always like that being like the mirrors into infinity. But was that fun for you all to write? Maybe Claire, you can tell us a little bit about creating these stories and stories, and I'll ask all three of you.
It was like my kind of cheating way of giving a bit of background to characters and to like really illuminate like how they became who they became, because my story is told in first person present. So, you know, Daphne's only heard, you know, the horror stories basically about the gods and like them manipulating other women. And then there's some gods where she's like, oh, I really love this god. And then she's like, wait, that person's actually really not that great once you meet them. And so like hearing these stories from those people themselves really like kind of opened up Daphne's eyes in a lot of ways. And I think that was really helpful.
And Loki comes in as a storyteller too, right? Loki has many titles, but in this book, Loki is a storyteller.
Oh yeah, he comes back and tells Angrboda about several of the myths that he directly participated in, and that was a lot of fun. Because I feel like the myths are a little bit different from Loki's perspective. He's the one who a lot of the times he gets the gods into trouble, but then he gets them out again, or comes up with a solution for a problem, or goes along and helps out. So he's a lot of fun.
That is fun. And Jennifer, in the beginning of your story, actually throughout, we are hearing some of the stories from another character who's kind of bringing the past to life for our main character. Was that fun for you to think about the story through that lens? Because that's how she's learning.
Yeah, and it's my favorite thing about Greek mythology, the way the stories intersect with each other, and the way that, you know, every little story leads on to another myth and introduces another character. And that was something that in the editing process we did have to take some of them out, because you could go on forever, I think, with mythology, telling those stories. But I love, just like you said, the mirrors to infinity, stories within a story. It's something I'm really drawn to as a reader. And I'd like to contrast the way that Theseus told the stories about himself to Ariadne, and later Dionysus tells a story about himself to Ariadne, and the way that those two characters tell their stories and the way that they want to present themselves, I thought was so revealing about the kind of men that they are as well. And I like to kind of plant those little seeds and those little hints about who they really are and what they what they tell us without realizing that they're telling us.
Yeah, that's textbook unreliable narrators for some characters that we, know maybe we shouldn't quite trust, but then we also love like these terrible characters. It's kind of a funny thing. We're reading about people doing awful things. We know what they're going to do, and yet we still kind of are enraptured. I can see how some of our heroines fall into these traps as I'm reading, and I'm like, oh, Loki, you're the best. Oh, Theseus, let me help you. Apollo, you're a great guy. And then it's like, are you really? So we can really identify with the main characters when that happens. A couple of people are asking this question, which is, choosing between Greek and Norse mythology. And maybe we'll just circle back to, and we're in a world full of we have access to lots of mythology from many cultures across the world, and actually very similar stories as we move into different cultures. But would like to hear just, specifically Greek and Norse, any, other types of mythology that you're interested in that maybe for the future. So Jennifer, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm really interested in learning more about Norse mythology, and I think The Witch of Heart is a good way into it. Because it's something I don't know very much about at all, apart from Loki from the Marvel universe. So I'm really interested to find out more about Norse mythology. I've read a book recently called Sister Song, which is based on a British folk ballad, and I think that's really a really great source of all kinds of interesting stories too. So going to kind of folklore. And my son is really interested in ancient Egyptian mythology, and he tells me a lot of stories from that, which I think would be very rewarding to explore as well. So yeah, I'm interested in all mythology, and I would like to know a lot more about all of them.
That's great. What about you, Genevieve?
I am too deep in Norse mythology probably to ever feel passionate about another mythology. I may casually learn about others, but like after reading the stories in their original language, it's kind of like, well, there's so much to unpack that I feel like I learn something new about Norse mythology every day. There's just so much there and so much to explore, so I'll probably keep at that.
And a follow-up question for you. Did you ever find yourself, and this is coming from Joe, did you ever find yourself questioning the translations?
Yes, I did. I have an Old Norse dictionary, and sometimes like translations matter. I don't know if anybody's read Maria Devana Headley's new translation of Beowulf, or Emily Wilson's new translation of the Odyssey, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, just like the opening parts, because I haven't gotten a chance to sit down and read it. Like, it's so different the way that things can be rendered, like from the same text. So yes, I have questioned translations a lot.
Even some recent scholarly new translations of religious texts from different cultures. I've read little bits and pieces there, and it's like, oh, the words do matter, and the implications and the socio-political status, and very interesting questions. Claire, so what kind of mythology else are you interested in? Are you firmly with the Greek mythology?
I do really love Greek mythology, but I mean, I did spend my formative years living in Scotland, so I really, really love Celtic mythology and Celtic stories, and especially Celtic creatures. I love Kelpies, but I think for right now, I'm pretty firmly in the Greek mythology, and maybe I'll eventually dabble in Roman. It's just moving up the years, right?
Absolutely. And you have all the control as the writer to kind of do the mashup. And I feel like we've mentioned Loki a couple times. So Genevieve, I'm just going to ask the question, are you going to be watching, are any of you going to be watching tomorrow, Loki, the new show?
Yes.
I have to. I feel like it's part of my job. Like,
yes, for research.
yes. I just, so many people have said, like, this Loki is the only thing I know from Marvel going into your book. And I feel like I have to know, because there's such like an overlap between, people who only know that Loki and who are like my book because of it, or thought to pick it up because of it. So
Yes.
yeah, I mean, like, I enjoyed Tom Hiddleston as Loki as well, but yeah, I'll definitely be watching.
Well, I think it's fair to say we're talking about literature here and fine books, and I thank you always for words. I love having words with me, but there is something to be said for the film and TV industry for bringing some of these mythological stories back, Luther and, what is heaven and hell? What is Norse mythology? What's Greek mythology? I tried to show my kids Clash of the Titans because I was like, come on, guys, this is like classic. And, the claymation, multi-headed beast came along and my kids were like, really, Mom, is this? And I was like, okay, there was a little gap there, but I support.
They had like the mechanical owl. I remember that, yeah.
Oh, the Medusa in that one was just amazing. Thank you, special effects, for progressing over the years. But okay, so the four of us will reconnect next week or at the end of the run of the TV show, just to do our little separate Loki like debrief, which will be fun. I'm going to go back into the Q&A and just have a quick peek at some of the questions. Let's see, one here related to the question of translations. How familiar, fluent are each of you with the native language of your respective mythologies? And Genevieve, you said you were reading Norse mythology in its original form. You can translate it. How about Claire or Jennifer? Are you reading any actual original texts?
Not at all, because actually I studied Latin and not ancient Greek, and now I wish that I could go back and change it, but it's not too late. I can still learn it, but I haven't read any of the original ancient Greek for this, so no.
It'd almost be hard to read them because they started out orally, so
Yeah.
I don't even think they've correctly or given a definitive date for when they transferred from oral to written, for like, at least for Greek mythology, if I remember correctly, but I only know like a smattering of Greek, enough that my Greek dictionary is really helpful.
Yeah.
Well, I earlier in the pandemic, Joshilyn Jackson and some authors, we participated in like a funny little just way to entertain ourselves by passing a story along. And so we just got the story from one author to another. And then if you've heard the first story and it went through 12 authors and the last story, it was usually quite a different story. So even these stories that we're referring to as, the story of Theseus, of Apollo, what might the original story have been if it was originally passed down orally is another question that we have.
Yeah.
I am going to remind everyone listening in to put questions in the Q&A. We have actually quite a few questions coming in, so thank you. But just as we're getting close to the top of the hour, if you have any other questions, one that came in was also about, would you say with mythology, or would you consider doing contemporary or modern or historical types of writing? Claire, would you branch out to other types of fiction?
I actually did. I'm messing right now with a historical mystery story, and that's been really tricky. It's a completely different era, but I think I'm pretty firmly in fantasy. So if I wasn't doing like ancient Greece, it'd just be some made up land.
How about you, Genevieve?
I'm doing historical fantasy right now. So I guess like The Witch's Heart is kind of like mythological fantasy-ish. I'm working on something a little bit more historical based, but still firmly fantasy, just because I like magic. I like the gods just like popping up and like telling you things. But I have written contemporary before, but just not published. So maybe one day, who knows?
Maybe one day. How about you, Jennifer?
Yeah, I just think I love magic, gods, monsters, and mythology, and I can't see myself writing something modern. There's so much more in that universe to explore that I think it would take me a long time to move into the present day.
Thank you for saying monsters. I love monsters so much. And fantasy allows us, you know, the dragons, the minotaur, and who knows why. It's because we live in a world with monstrous people, and it's a great way. But Joy Pope's comment was, she's been waiting for the perfect retelling of Cassandra's story. And so she's just putting it out there for one of the three of you to write it. It's not a question, but Cassandra's story is often a favorite out there in the community.
Well, she's stay tuned for my next book is all I'll say about that.
Well, how about this? I'd love to know what you are working on, and maybe you could give us a little teaser, Jennifer, about your next book, and we'll hear about everybody's upcoming projects.
And so my next novel is called Electra, and it focuses on the story of Electra, who's the daughter of Clytemnestra, but it revolves around the three women whose lives are shattered by Agamemnon. So that's Clytemnestra, his wife, Electra, his daughter, and Cassandra, the woman that he takes from Troy.
Okay, that was actually, if I said my original like favorite story from that, that's the one. I just was always super fascinated. So that's exciting. Claire, what's next for you?
I'm working on the sequel to Daughter of Sparta right now. It's called, it gives away the setting, it's Blood of Troy. So Cassandra is also in that one, but it's Daphne and Apollo again making a ruckus. And when I went into it, because the Iliad and the Trojan War has been done so many times, I really needed to find a way to make it authentic and something new. So I'm hoping that there will be enough new stuff to surprise readers and interest them, while also, you know, hearkening back to like the things that we loved about the story, like Cassandra and Cassandra's plight and like her strength in a lot of ways. You see that in that too. So,
oh, excellent. Genevieve.
So I can't talk specifically about what my next project is because publishing, but it's another historical fantasy, but centered on another quasi-historical Viking Age woman who is infamous for doing things, but maybe we'll try to see why she did those things or go through her early years, which are unknown to historians. So we'll see. Hopefully I'll be able to share more soon.
You know what? We love a cliffhanger. So dun dun dun. So a story about a quasi Viking heroine, something amazing happens. Sounds like a great book.
I wouldn't go.
It sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And someone's comment, Shannon in the Q&A says, mythology is having a moment in books. Why do you think, any of you, just let me know, why is mythology so hot right now?
It's both nostalgic, while I feel like all of us are kind of making something new. So we're kind of digging into the nostalgia and what we loved from our childhood, while also kind of fixing things that were wrong and how the women were treated. Because as we've said before, you know, it depends on the translator for a lot of these stories. And I feel like that's kind of what we're doing for all of us. We're being the translator and we're giving the voices that these women were never given before. So I think that's why it's so interesting. Like the Women of Troy, I believe, by Pat Barker, and how she gave that voice to Briseis that we never really got before. That one was another interesting story.
What do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah, exactly that. I think that so many of us know so much about these stories, and they're so great when we are children, and like we said, it's monsters and gods and heroes and exciting things, but when you come back to them as an adult, you realize there is still so much more to discover. And I think that's so exciting when you go back to the same story and you think, no, there's this character, and there's all of this other story, and all of these nuances and complexities that we can pull out of it. So it's the perfect blend of something that we already love and then something new to discover, and to find so many parallels with our lives today as well, and so many themes that resonate across the centuries. I find that so magical. to just think we've got, you know, this common thread running through that connects us with people who lived thousands of years ago. I don't think that ever becomes stale. So I think that there's so much more scope for mythological retellings.
Absolutely. Genevieve?
Yeah, just, I mean, echoing what you both said, it's a lot of like, we're drawn to things that are familiar to us, I think. And in a lot of ways, when we write about mythology, we're basically writing fan fiction. There's like certain parameters that we have to consider when we're writing, but still provide readers with like a twist that's believable within the context of these stories that they are already familiar with. And to make the stories accessible to people who maybe aren't familiar with the stories in the first place. So it's a challenge, but like you both said, it's a worthwhile one. And there's a lot to say about you know, why these myths still resonate with us after so long as well.
Absolutely. And I found myself reading your stories and then going back to my mythology source books, because I do have quite a few, to say, well, what do I remember? I think I remember, but then going back. So it was almost like I was in college, because I was like, oh, wait, is this going to happen? Is this? So you're also kind of encouraging people to think about the source material. So it's fantasy and magic and monsters, big themes, but it was also academic. And for me, you know, if you're a nerd, I want to kind of go back and visit my old friends and, you know, see the reboot version. And that's like a great way for me to think about these stories. And for those of you listening in, I'd love to issue a challenge, because I think these 3 books, I'm in that book club that's like, we're a great book club, but I'm like, if there's a book club that can do all 3 of these books, because they're so great to read together. Or the summer has started, you know, pick a book a month for your book club, talk about these stories. There's so many interesting things. And these are books that you can actually share with, you know, if you have school age kids. I have kids that are in high school. And it's never too early to hear. And if they're reading mythology, they already know who ate whose kids and who, you know, had a baby with a bull and all the fun things. So the range of my mom to my kids, we can all read these books. So I'd encourage listeners to think about getting their friends together to dissect these stories. I think we have time for one more question, and maybe just some other authors you've been reading, just to close out our session of, you know, who else is making you excited in the literary community right now? How about you, Claire?
Right now, I am reading Hannah Whitten's For the Wolf. I'm really liking that one. It's also another retelling, reimagining. Maybe that's just like my thing these days.
Yes.
And then what else have I read? I really liked the Mexican Gothic. That one was really good. So.
Oh, good. Jennifer, what are you reading?
And so, well, I read it recently, and I'm going to keep rereading, I think. I would really recommend The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper, which is set in ancient Pompeii. It's the first of a trilogy, and it tells the story of the women enslaved in the brothel in Pompeii, which sounds like it's going to be really very dark, and it certainly has dark elements, but it has got so much hope and dignity and humour, and it's absolutely brilliant. So that's more ancient history than mythology, but definitely I would recommend that.
Oh, great. And how about you, Genevieve?
Actually, my copy of The Wolf Den just arrived today from the UK.
Brilliant.
I don't believe it's out in the US yet. So so I'm really looking forward to that one. And then I also did read Sister Song by Lucy Holland, because I ordered that from the UK too. It's out in the US in November, but that is it's really good. It's based on a folk ballad, and it's just like the twists and turns, because I wasn't familiar with the original ballad going in. I was like, this is probably fine, right? It was not fine. And then I'm also reading, I read For the Wolf, also very good, and The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reed. I just got that one today, and even though I've already read it, I'll probably read it again.
I got that one today too. I'm so excited.
Good day for books.
Well, I am so excited. Thank you all. So today we have Claire Andrews with Daughter of Sparta, Genieve Gornichec, The Witch's Heart, and Jennifer Sate Ariadne. And these books are amazing. Yes, they're on the screen. Thank you. Please contact Little Shop of Stories. Also,
Did my internet cut out?
No. Nikki, I think you froze. Yeah.
I was about to say, okay. I was like, oh, at least. Oh
Oh
Mhm.
no. Well, I was really glad
One
to talk to you,
second,
ladies.
sorry.
I made sure, Jennifer, by the way, to get the British version for your book.
And
Yeah,
Jennifer,
beautiful.
does your dress or top match the book cover? I was noticing that. Did you do that on purpose?
Yeah, I just
love
can't stop myself from doing that. Yeah.
I love it.
All the time.
All right, ladies. Well, I've been promoted and I'm back in the game. It's also strange. We're having a little bit of weather in Georgia. It's been raining off and on, and I know a couple of our libraries today reported that their phones and internet had gone down due to pop-up storms. So maybe Nikki just got caught in one of those things. But thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Staying up late, Jennifer, and joining us from the UK. Thank you all so much for coming and hearing this conversation and allowing us into your homes tonight. We will be back with another event next Tuesday, so don't forget to go to Eventbrite and register for that one. And we will see you all again very, very soon. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone,
Thanks,
for coming.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye, guys.